Hey guys, welcome back to Coach Hall Writes. If you are an AP Lit student, chances are you are preparing for question 3, the larger work question. And so students often ask me which books or plays should I be reading in order to prepare for the exam. And they want easy books. So in this case, easy means something short that is easy to understand. And so we're going to be talking about Animal Farm. It's just 10 chapters long, and so you could read it over a weekend. You could read it in one night if you had to. So if you're curious about that, I've got several different prompts that it applies to, and we're going to talk about how you could use it. Due to the controversial nature of Animal Farm, the author actually used a pen name. So George Orwell is not his real name, it's a pseudonym. His real name is Eric Blair. And so under the name George Orwell, he published both Animal Farm and 1984, which is also a very common book taught in high school literature classes. Animal Farm is an allegorical novel. So an allegory is actually a work that has multiple symbols that work together in order to form an underlying political or moral message. So in this case, all the symbols work together to create this message against communism, in this case specifically against communist Russia and the dangers of totalitarianism and tyrannical governments. One of the most important pieces of information I think students need to know about question 3 is that when it says contributes to the meaning of the work as a whole, this is asking about theme. You can also talk about plot development and character development, but you want to make sure that you are explicitly stating a theme. You don't have to use the word theme, but you need to be looking at the universal message of the piece. And so everything that you read, you should be able to identify at least one, but ideally 2 or 3 themes of the text. And so for AP Lit, it's also important to realize that you don't want to analyze only a portion of the novel. So not just the beginning, not just the end. You want a scope that encompasses everything. And so for this particular text, the subject that I've listed is the dangers of totalitarianism. So the subject is what the book is about. The theme should be written as a sentence. It needs to be written as a complete thought. A lot of resources online actually list a subject as the theme. And while I think a lot of people just accept those as themes, it's important to realize that you want to use the subject as a vehicle to get to the theme. And so there are other subjects of the novel too. For instance, you could look at how education is used. For example, how Napoleon suppresses the animals' knowledge, and by suppressing their knowledge, he suppresses their power. You can look at class stratification. You can look at cruelty and violence within the book. And so there's lots of different subjects. And so it's important to connect those to a larger truth and ideally be able to put that in sentence form. Now, you would work the theme presumably into another sentence, but it's important to realize that you must understand theme if you want to try to get a 5 out of 9 or higher. So a 5 out of 9 is considered sort of like the lowest of the passing scores on the essay. And so for my classes, I teach AP Lang, but I am familiar with AP Lit. We work at this understanding that you need to get a 5 or higher. And so there are certain things that are non-negotiables. For AP Lit, question 3, theme is non-negotiable. It must be in there. There was a recent prompt that had to do with setting and how that impacted the novel. And so for Animal Farm, it's set in England. However, the setting is also in some sense symbolic because it represents communist Russia. And there's different elements to the setting. For instance, there are 2 neighboring farms, so one represents Germany, the other represents the US and or Britain. And so basically, there's different elements to the setting as well, so different features. For instance, the windmill. The animals build the windmill and it represents progress. However, it's destroyed twice, and one of the times Napoleon basically uses it as a means of rallying the animals together. He blames Snowball, even though we as readers know that Snowball had nothing to do with it. But it actually serves to unify the animals, and so we see it as manipulation, but it does serve his goals, his being Napoleon's in this case. And another aspect of the farm that's brought up rather prominently toward the end is this idea that there's a field, a pasture for the superannuated animals, so basically those that are at or near retirement age. And initially this was promised to them as being a benefit for all their hard work over the years. However, The pigs discover that they can grow barley or use barley to make alcohol, and so they turn that field into basically a barley field, and they use it for themselves. And so that could also potentially be an element of setting, because it connects to theme in that we see this manipulation and this just abuse of the masses in order to basically propel the benefits of the few. And so there's different elements to setting. And so I wouldn't necessarily choose this novel to write about setting, but I think it's important to at least understand the setting and how it impacts the book. Because Animal Farm is an allegory, there are multiple symbols that work together throughout the text. So, for instance, Napoleon represents Stalin, Snowball represents Trotsky, the sheep are like the blinded masses, they just follow blindly. Boxer represents the working class, the dogs represent the KGB, the list goes on. And there's plenty of information out there about what animal symbolizes which group or which person or which element of communist Russia and so forth. So there are lots of symbols to work with. A lot of teachers that I know use a prompt from the AP exam that has to do with symbolism. And so the prompt actually says to choose one symbol. So if you're given a prompt that says to choose one symbol, Animal Farm can be a really good book to use, but you want to make sure that you are highlighting how one symbol changes or progresses throughout the text. With an allegory, it can be really, really tempting to incorporate multiple symbols. And if it says choose one symbol, then you don't get bonus points for adding in all these others. So if I had to choose one symbol, I think my inclination right now would be to choose Boxer because of his story arc and how he ultimately is essentially killed. He's slaughtered or sold to the horse slaughterer in chapter 9. And, he's just this character that I think you kind of you sympathize with. And he's like the one character where you just can't help but love him because he's a bit naive, but he's really hardworking and he is so strong throughout the book. And then the one moment that he needs his strength, it fails him and he can't break out of the wooden cart that is taking him away. And so I would say I would analyze Boxer and just how he represents the working class of Russia and how mistreated they were, and also how naive and slightly gullible they were. They had the best intentions. They believed everything that they were told. Not necessarily the brightest if we're going by Boxer's characterization, because he can't learn more than 4 letters of the alphabet at a time, and then when he learns more, he forgets the previous ones. But he is a really genuine character. And so I think if I had to choose one symbol to write an entire essay about, I would probably choose Boxer, because I think you could also technically talk about how Animal Farm symbolizes communist Russia, but I think I would be worried that if I were to write that essay, or if my students were to write that essay, that it would be tempting to tackle other symbols. And so just kind of keep that in mind. I do think you can definitely write about the symbolism in Animal Farm for sure, but if the prompt says choose one symbol, then I would be very clear to choose a symbol that you can get a lot out of, because some of the symbols in Animal Farm I think are really minor, and I don't know that you could get a whole essay out of them. In regards to a turning point in the novel that relates to theme, I would choose when Napoleon basically is able to drive out Snowball. So Napoleon raises the puppies in secret. The puppies are the dogs. They grow up to be the dogs that represent the KGB, and they chase Snowball away. So if you know Russian history, basically Trotsky, who, is represented by Snowball in the novel, was driven out of Russia. He was exiled, I believe, to Mexico, and I was told he was assassinated by Stalin's men while he was in Mexico, and he was killed with a ball-peen hammer. So basically, when Snowball's driven away, we know that he presumably has been killed, but the animals don't really know this. They find little droplets of blood. But Napoleon uses this for his own benefit. And so I think it's a turning point because Snowball's the only one that actually challenges Napoleon. And in the beginning, you see Snowball emerge as what seems to be a good leader, and Napoleon is actually not a very strong leader in the beginning, but then he has this personality type that is able to take over and undermine Snowball, and then ultimately be the one that, wins that battle and is able to control Animal Farm. So I think a turning point would be when Snowball is actually driven out, because then basically, if we're looking at the dangers of totalitarianism, there is no one stopping Napoleon from being a dictator. Another recent AP Lit prompt had to do with cruelty, and I think you could make Animal Farm work for this, especially if you're really struggling to come up with something. So what I would do if I was planning this essay would be to look at all the different acts of cruelty, ideally in chronological order. Some of the bad things, if you will, that happen toward the beginning of the book aren't necessarily cruelty. Like, for instance, Boxer accidentally kills a farmhand during the battle, but he didn't mean to. However, as time goes on, you can think about cruelty in a very direct sense of the fact that they kill a couple of the animals, and ultimately in chapter 9, Boxer is killed and sold, essentially sold to be killed. And considering he was their most loyal follower, that's not only cruelty, that's this huge act of betrayal, in my opinion. So there's definitely some violence and cruelty within the book, but I think if you look at cruelty in a different sense, for instance, the fact that the animals are essentially starving and the pigs are eating the milk and the apples and they're living in comforts, whereas the rest of the animals are not, that could be seen as an act of cruelty as well, because they're manipulating their word. They basically said at the beginning that all animals were equal, and then by the end, it's all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. So there's this sort of psychological cruelty that's going on because they're manipulating the animals, and the animals don't even know it, but they're being treated miserably. They're being subjected to these long work hours and really arduous chores, and the pigs are totally exempt from these things. And so in some sense, that's one way you could look at cruelty as well. That might be a really good duality to an essay, is looking at the sort of emotional cruelty versus the physical cruelty. And I think that concept would apply to other novels as well. But I think Animal Farm could work if you had to write an essay on cruelty. So when teaching Animal Farm to my pre-AP English 10 class, I had them write about deception because that was a released AP Lit prompt that we were working with. And one of the things that they noticed right away is that the laws change. And so we see acts of deception pretty early on in the novel. First of all, the apples go missing. And so it's pretty obvious that the pigs have taken the apples. We see the deception in how rhetoric is used to manipulate the masses. So this abuse of language that relates to or causes an abuse of power. So that would be a thematic link there. For instance, when Squealor starts talking about how they need the milk and apples to make them strong because, thinking takes a lot of brain power, and therefore, they really need their stamina and their strength, and that comes from the extra food, and all this kind of manipulated sense of what's really going on. As the novel progresses, we see changes in the we see changes in the commandments as they're amended, but the problem is that no one really realizes that they're amended, and basically the animals, specifically the pigs, are like, oh no, it was always this way, guys. You remember. They even rewrite their own history, which is another element of deception. So when the animals stand up a little bit, at one point Boxer's like, wait a minute, I don't remember the Battle of Cowshed happening that way. I thought Snowball was actually a good guy. And then Squealor gets actually quite angry. So Squealor is a pig that represents the basically propaganda and the press, and he's constantly whisking his tail and his eyes dart back and forth, and so you can tell that he's lying. These are sort of the character traits that show he's lying. And then when someone stands up to him and tries to challenge him just for a split second, then his mannerisms change. And so Squealor is actually a really strong character to analyze for the deception because he's kind of in charge of speaking to the animals and therefore deceiving them. But the whole premise of Animal Farm and how they use language to manipulate the animals, so they abuse language and ultimately abuse power, that ties in beautifully with this deception prompt. There's a lot to say. You just want to make sure that you actually delve into a couple of the deceptions and not just list them. So for instance, you would want to examine why it's significant that they change the commandments and lie about changing them, as opposed to just noting that they changed the commandments. And ultimately, all of the commandments get changed. At the end of the novel, we see the pigs walking on two legs, and Basically, you can't tell the difference between who's a pig and who's a human. Some students absolutely hate that ending, but I think that's kind of like the ultimate deception there, is that you can't tell who they are anymore because they've become the thing that they hated the most. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope it was helpful to understand how to use Animal Farm in relation to some really common recently released AP prompts. I recommend Animal Farm just because it is short, the language is very contemporary, and the one challenge I think students might have is just if you don't know the Russian history behind it, then some of the symbolism might not make sense. So I would do a little bit of research perhaps before picking up this book. But overall, this is a great one if you're just looking for one more book to have in your arsenal in order to prepare for that AP Lit question 3 essay. I say this is a really good one because it can be used a lot. It's not necessarily the most commonly listed novel, but it is one that has been deemed as having literary merit, and so it's definitely fair game for that question. So anyway, thank you guys so much for your time. I really appreciate you watching. If you like this kind of content, please don't forget to like and subscribe. And until next time, guys, happy writing.